Listen up, and listen close. Crime's a dark and dirty road, and all that's waiting at the end is the jailhouse or the hangman's rope. They say the house always wins. Whether you're gambling with money, hearts, or your own life, the debt'll always come due, and it's easy to find yourself on a losing streak. Our Vic tonight, a dentist, thought he'd been dealt a pretty good hand. Seemed that way to everyone else too, that is, until he wound up dead. A guy goes for a short nap and ends up taking the big sleep, well, that's got our name written all over it, sleuths. See if you get to the answer quicker than I did, as we solve the case of the Strangled Surgeon. Everyone hates going to the dentist, but this case gave us no choice. Tonight's drink is the Laughing Gas, a Vault original, named in honor of the wacky stuff those quacks pump into your lungs before they yank a tooth. Think of it as a South Side with a gassy champagne twist, and enough mint to freshen the breath and keep the doctor away. It's sharp enough to keep you on your toes, and like its namesake, strong enough to make you forget all your troubles. The only difference is this one won't knock you out cold, unless you drink too many, of course. Let's get to work. I was having lunch with my pal Bob Hollister when the phone rang. The call was for him. Unsurprisingly, we were at his place. He went to the phone as I worked on Laughing Gas number 3 and came back visibly shaken. "Frank's been murdered," he blurted, his voice cracking. Dr. Frank Brandon wasn't just Bob's dentist. He was his buddy. "That's too bad, Bob," I offered. Then, because the gumshoe's never off the clock, "Do they know how he was killed?" "It was his assistant calling, Jane Wharton," he said. "She was rattled 6 ways from Sunday, but I made out that Dr. Pearson, the sawbones next door, found bruises on Frank's throat and figured he'd been strangled." "Any suspects?" She didn't say, just that they'd called the cops. He laughed shakily. "You know, 3 days back, Frank made a gag that if he was ever murdered, he'd want Dash Mulligan on the case. We had a good laugh, but Jane turned white as a ghost. Maybe she had a feeling." He slumped against the doorframe like he just had the wind knocked out of him. "Maybe it wasn't just a gag. Maybe he had a reason to be scared," I said, the rusty cogs in my head beginning to turn. "He sure didn't seem scared, at least not to me. If he had any enemies, he kept them under his hat. Frank was a swell guy, everyone thought so." Old Bob seemed like the question was on his lips, but I saved him the trouble. You know I can't resist a mystery, and I'd already decided to take the case. "Let's talk things over on the way. We'll take your car," I said, and we headed downstairs. "Okay, Bob, lay it out for me. Just the facts," I said as we pulled into traffic. "All right," Bob said. "The doc would always grab lunch at 12, be back by 12:30. Jane would step out after, come back by 1:30. The doc would crash on the couch in his lab in the meantime, smoke a cigarette, maybe catch a nap till she came up to wake him. Today, Jane couldn't rouse him, so she ran for help. Dr. Jeanette and Dr. Pearson, both from adjoining offices. They found Frank dead, called the cops. Jane tried calling my office, but I wasn't in, so she called me at home. That's all. Oh wait, one more detail. The window in the lab was wide open. Funny thing is, the doc always kept it closed when he was napping. Didn't like the draft." "All right," I said, mulling it over. I know he'd call in the doc quite often, knew who he palled around with, as well as his clients. "What about women? Any dames with a soft spot for him?" Bob snorted. "That'd be putting it mildly. The girls love Frank, even the married ones. Between you and me, he wasn't exactly gentle with their feelings." "Okay, was he rough enough to drive anyone to murder, man or woman?" He thought for a moment. "Sure, that could be some husband or lover I don't know about, but the women seemed harmless enough. Jane's just a kid, barely out of her teens, practically worshipped the guy. Then there's Norma Jordan, Dr. Pearson's assistant. To listen to Norma, Jane's been green with envy over Frank paying her attention, but that's just office gossip. I'm sure Frank wasn't taking either of them seriously, though. They're both nice girls. Jane's petite and pretty, and Norma's got the looks of a model. There's talk about Norma and Dr. Jeanette, though he's married. Could just be more gossip, you know how it is." I stored all this away in the dusty file cabinets in my brain. "All right, and how about Brandon's life outside of work? Any bad habits or financial problems?" "Oh, money was no issue. Frank was doing great. In fact, again, just between us, he told me once he was making triple what Dr. Jeanette was, even though he's only been practicing for 4 years, in comparison to Jeanette's 15. He practiced anywhere besides this office?" I asked. "No, he started practicing there right out of school. He had a pretty rough go of it the first year, but his personality and skill soon won the others over, and Jeanette's patients even started flooding to him instead of Jeanette. That got filed away too. I know you're a poker guy, Bob, was my next comment. Ever deal the dock in on one of your games? Bob admitted that Brandon had loved the game as much as he did, and that he never missed the sessions held in Pearson's X-ray room, an unlikely gambling den connected to the doctor's lab by an adjoining door. But, he said in conclusion, those games sure didn't cause him any financial worries. Quite the opposite. I never saw a guy in such a hot streak. Seemed like you couldn't lose. Okay, so who were the big losers in these little clandestine sessions? I grinned. Other than you, of course. I think we all donated to the Dr. Brennan Poker Fund at one time or another, he said wryly. Doc Pearson's been bellyaching about his luck lately. As for Jeanette, he's a quiet guy, never says much, win or lose. But he's been throwing money around like he's going out of style. He sent some big checks Brandon's way, and no mistake. The other two doctors haven't been making out so well either. By this time, we were pulling up outside the Eldridge building, where all these fascinating characters plied their trade. Inside the building, we took the elevator to the 10th floor. On exiting, I stopped in the hall to make a note of the floor plan. The narrow concrete and steel stairway was next to the elevator, connecting the floors. Straight ahead was Dr. Brennan's reception room, with Dr. Jeanette's office to the left and Dr. Pearson's suite to the right. On either side of these were other physicians' and surgeons' offices. Bob led me into Doc Brennan's waiting room. As we walked in, a girl got up from a chair where she'd been slumped like yesterday's laundry. Her eyes were red from crying. Jane, Bob said, this is Mr. Mulligan, the private eye. To me, he added, this is Jane Wharton, Frank's assistant. Jane was obviously in pieces over the death of the doctor, but managed to tell us the police were in the laboratory. After a few words of sympathy, we proceeded through the operating room and knocked on the door to the lab. A burly fellow in plain clothes swung it open. The moment he saw me, his face soured like he'd just sucked on a lemon. In my line of work, ticking off Johnny Law from time to time just comes with the territory. Detective Sergeant Wilson reluctantly waved us in, though he looked as though he'd rather swallow nails. There was a uniform with him, eyeing me like I'd just stepped on his foot. I'd stacked the facts of the case neatly in my head on the ride over. Since stepping into the building, I'd been soaking up every detail like a dry sponge. That was the groundwork. Now we were at the crime scene, it was time to really get my hands dirty. The lab was small, sure, but it had the clean, orderly feel of a man who didn't tolerate clutter in his work or in his life. A well-organized lab bench rested up against the wall that connected with the operating room. Opposite this was a narrow couch topped with a thin mattress and a single pillow. It was here that Dr. Brandon had been temporarily laid to rest, still in his high-collared dentist getup. The window at the foot of the couch sat open, as Jane had discovered it when she found the body. A machine of some kind stood at the head of the couch with a door behind it. I gestured at the door with my chin, and Bob, catching my meaning, nodded his confirmation that this led to the X-ray room where the infamous card games had taken place. Now I had the lay, I started going over things in a little more detail. I examined the marks on the throat, the face, and the hands. I spent a little time lingering over what appeared to be a shaving cut, and then moved to look at the ashtray that stood near to Brandon's head, still full of ash and cigarette butts. I could feel Wilson's eyes burning a hole in my back, and knew that he was admiring my work, though wild horses wouldn't have dragged that out of him. Once I straightened up, he pretended like he hadn't been watching, and remarked, "Well, I guess there's not much here to see. I'm going to get these people together for some questioning. They probably know things they aren't letting on." He jerked a thumb at the uniform. "Bring me Dr. Pearson and his assistant, Norman Jordan. Park them in Brandon's reception room." Then he turned on his heel. "I'll handle Jeanette myself." As Wilson and the uniform left the lab, I pointed Bob towards a detail that they hadn't noticed, and I hadn't wanted them to. I leaned over the body of Brandon and traced my finger up the plaster wall just above the place where Brandon's hand now rested at his side. Scratched in the plaster was the word Jane. Bob leaned in, squinting at it. "What am I looking at?" I picked up Dr. Brandon's right hand. "Look at the white powder under the thumbnail. Now look at the thin line tracing down from the E on the wall," I muttered, not wanting anyone else to hear. Bob's gaze followed mine. His lips pressed into a thin line as it sank in. Brandon had something to say before he cashed out. We just had to figure out what it meant. "He wrote this as he was losing consciousness," I told Bob. The line trailing down from the E was made as his arm dropped lifeless to his side. It seemed that Jane was in Brandon's thoughts up until his final moments. The question was, why? We passed through to the reception room, hoping a little light questioning might clear things up. Dr. Pearson, Miss Jordan, Jane, and Dr. Jeanette, with Wilson in the uniform, had all congregated in the reception room by now. The tension in there was thick enough to cut with a knife, so I suggested we take the conversation somewhere a little less stifling. Wilson agreed, though reluctantly. Dr. Jeanette readily suggested his waiting room, so we settled ourselves in there for a nice long chat. Jeanette's office looked like it hadn't seen a decent paying client in months. All peeling wallpaper and faded furniture. The kind of place you'd expect to find dust bunnies, not patients. I guess this was why he had no assistant. He couldn't afford one. It was a million miles from Brandon's polished setup. I took this opportunity to size up all the prominent figures in this case. Dr. Pearson was a man past 50 with bushy graying hair and brows, strong rangy body, massive hands, and black penetrating eyes. Dr. Jeanette was a man of about 40, short and round but not fat, with thin scraggly hair and blurred dissipated eyes. And then there were the two girls, Jane Wharton and Norma Jordan. Miss Jordan was... well, I'll just remind you that I mentioned prominent figures a second ago and leave it at that. She was dressed up to the nines, all diamonds and fur, not the type of baubles your average doctor's assistant could afford on her own. This, I gathered, was a favorite topic for the gossip girls on the floor. Dr. Jeanette sat closer to her than was probably advisable for a married man. I decided to boost Wilson's ego a little by letting him take point on the questioning. He started with Jane and Norma, but Jane couldn't tell us anything she hadn't already said on the phone, and Norma didn't have anything to add. In fact, that vision of loveliness said she needed to leave as she just returned from a trip, and Wilson let her go after the usual spiel about not leaving town. Finally, Wilson asked Dr. Jeanette if he'd heard anyone enter Brandon's office while Jane was out to lunch. People often came and went during the hour Dr. Brandon liked to take his little nap. It got so I stopped noticing them, came the answer. Then, I suppose there were some today. Jane spoke up then, saying, just after Dr. Brandon left for lunch, a young man came in and asked to see him. When I told him the doctor wouldn't be back till 1:30, he always had me tell the patients that, though he really came back at 12:30. The man left. He was hardly more than a boy, but thinking about it now, I guess he did act kind of strange. She continued reflectively. You don't suppose, Dr. Jeanette, it could have anything to do with the patient we had this morning? Patient this morning? I pressed, noting that Jeanette squirmed a little when this was brought up. Well, Jeanette clearly didn't like me pressing, but he reluctantly volunteered. I gave a patient of Dr. Brandon's a general anesthetic, nitrous oxide, this morning for a tooth extraction. You see, Dr. Brandon has a nitrous machine, and when he has a patient that needs a general, I give the anesthetic, and for my patients, we wheel the machine into my office and he gives the gas. This morning, when Sarah Butler, a girl of about 19, came out from under the anesthetic, she had a bewildered look and became very much agitated. Dr. Brandon recognized the symptoms immediately. The gas had given her a mild case of psychosis, as can happen in an extreme minority of cases. The girl was convinced that she was in danger. Brandon tried to quiet her, explaining that she was perfectly safe and no one had harmed her, but she ran out of the operating room in a hysterical frame of mind. And on her way out, Jane added quickly, the girl muttered something about telling her brother. I guess that may have been the boy that came by later on. Wilson slapped the table and shouted, now we're getting someplace. This brother's the fellow we want. Get me the girl's address. And Jane got him the address from the girl's chart, and Wilson dashed away, leaving the uniform in charge. While we waited for Wilson to perform his noble duty, I decided to see if Jane had anything else to say. I guess he thought quite a lot of the doctor, I asked her. Yeah, she said timidly, but I don't think he cared much about me. Oh, I don't know about that, I replied, thinking about her name scratched in the wall. He has so many girls, and just lately he was paying lots of attention to Norma Jordan, she said, a little bitterly. I don't know that Norma was really his type of girl, I said, trying to console her. Just the same, he spent the last weekend with her in the country and just got back late this morning, Jane said with a flash of jealousy. She and I aren't on speaking terms, but I learned from the other girls on the floor that Norma had boasted to them about it. This was something new, and it immediately aroused my interest. I would have questioned her further, but it seemed she felt she'd said too much. Before I could get any more out of her, the phone rang. The call was for the uniform, who listened a moment, then announced that Wilson had arrested one Will Butler, the brother of the young girl who got the gas that morning. This Butler admitted to coming to the office, but swore on his mother's knitting needles he'd gone back to his work when told the doctor wasn't available until 1:30. Wilson said he was bringing the kid up in a few minutes and was going to put the screws to him. In his mind, the case was solved. 15 minutes later, Wilson appeared with a tall, pale kid in tow. The cuffs on his wrists looked too heavy for him, and his knees had all the starch of a wet newspaper. He swayed a little, like a man trying to decide whether to faint now or ask for permission. Wilson barked to the uniform to fetch Jeanette. Then he stepped out of the office, too. The uniform soon reappeared with Jeanette, and Wilson returned in a moment with one of the elevator girls. Addressing the elevator girl and pointing to the butler kid, Wilson asked, "Is this the fellow you brought up in the car?" "Yeah, that's the one. The reason I remember him is because I brought him up and took him back. The first time just after the 12 o'clock rush was over, and the second time a little while after the 1 o'clock rush. He seemed excited, and every time he got in the car, he took off his cap. This stood out to me because the fellas in this building usually leave their caps on." Wilson dismissed the girl, and turning to Butler said, "You see, we have the proof that you returned here a second time." He then seized the youth by the shoulder and hurled him into a chair. "Now, Butler," Wilson said fiercely, "confess. We got the goods on you, and you'll only make matters worse by denying it." "I was up here right after 12, Butler said, trembling, "but when the girl said the doctor wouldn't be back until after 1:30, I went back to work. I can prove at the office that I started back to work at 1. Honest, I can." "I don't doubt you went back to work at 1, Wilson ranted. "But before then, or between 1 and 1:30, you came back here and killed Brandon. Cut out your lying and spill." Butler only kept repeating, "I didn't kill him." I let this play out, though I could see that all Wilson's roughhousing would get him nowhere. This kid was no murderer. Wilson now seized Butler by the collar, jerked him to his feet, and dragged him into the operating room and through the swinging door into the lab, where he bellowed, "I'll show you your dirty work. Maybe that'll change your tune." I followed close behind Wilson and the young man, and the other players in this little drama weren't far behind. Wilson hurled Butler headlong against the couch and the body of Brandon and roared, There's your filthy work." In terror, Butler brought the backs of his manacled hands over his eyes, screaming, Yeah, I killed him. Take me away. I don't want to see him." Then he sank to the floor, sobbing. "I knew it," crowed Sergeant Wilson, throwing out his chest triumphantly. I continued to let the scene play out. Maybe I'd let Wilson know the actual killer once he was done blowing hot air. Between sobs, Butler cried, "I didn't mean to kill him. Honest, I didn't. I was crazy when Rachel told me she'd been mistreated, and I rushed up here and found the doctor out. I went back to work, but the more I thought about it, the madder I got. So I came back, and finding the doctor asleep, I took him by the throat and strangled him. I didn't know what I was doing, but my sister's everything in the world to me, and I was crazy." He stopped, gaining control of himself. Then he said more quietly, "Now I've only made things worse, and they'll hang me. I know that I was wrong because this afternoon at the office, my friend told me that people sometimes have bad dreams when they take nitrous oxide, and so the doctor was right when he told Rachel that." "Come on now," Wilson broke in roughly. "Stop your blubbering. You killed a man. Being sorry won't keep you from paying for it." "Yeah, I killed him," Butler said piteously, "but I wish I hadn't." I thought the poor kid had suffered enough. I helped him into a chair and told him, "Buck up, son. May not be as bad as you think." "I'll hang or be put in prison for life," Butler cried. I decided to let everyone in on what was really happening here. "You came in here to settle a score for your sister. Oh, I know you didn't have killing on your mind, but you'd have been guilty just the same if you had killed Dr. Brandon. Luckily for you, you didn't. Why don't you tell us what did happen? After you came in here and grabbed Doc Brandon by the throat, that is." A feverish silence filled the room after I was done talking. The kid just looked at me with eyes like saucers, too surprised to speak. As I continued, I hoped the real killer was paying attention. Sometimes when they feel the noose tightening, they hang themselves all on their own. "Did the doctor wake up or struggle at all as you wrapped your hands around his throat?" "No, I can see from your face you realize he didn't." "Peculiar, no? Look here. Close against the couch is this flimsy pedestal with an ashtray on top, and its contents haven't been disturbed. These things are so damn flimsy they'll spill everywhere if you even look at them wrong. But what sort of man would remain perfectly still, even while being strangled? Anyone would wake up, even if it was just long enough for a fight. You see, kid, this doctor was dead before you even laid a hand on him." Now, from the corner where I stood at the head of the couch, I rolled out the nitrous oxide machine. "This," I continued, "is the cause of Dr. Brandon's death." The whole time I was talking, I kept my attention on the others in the room. Was the killer starting to crack? Did they already know the jig was up? Remember the open window? Doc never kept it that way when he was sleeping. Didn't like the draft. This was left open to let out the smell of the gas, and here's a detail that makes sense now. Before, I took this for a shaving cut with a little smear of blood around it. If I know my job, we'll find a spot of blood on the nosepiece of the machine. I showed this part to the enthralled audience. Sure enough, there was a splotch of blood visible on the rubber. Next, I pointed out the scratch on the plaster wall. The victim awoke for a moment, and with the last of his strength, he attempted to scratch a message here, a clue to his killer. J-A-N-E. Jane started. "Me? But I would never..." I held up a hand. Remember, the doctor only had a few seconds before he was overcome by the effects of the gas. Before he could complete his message, his arm dropped to his side and he took the long nap, but not before he'd written enough to identify his killer. Even a flat-foot greenhorn could tell that kid was no murderer. What do you think, sleuths? Who took Doc Brandon out of the game? A few of these folks could have wanted him bumped off for a few different reasons, but in the end, our investigation points to one name. The writing, as they say, is on the wall. If you got a name, try for a means and motive while I mix a drink. Then when I get back, it's cards on the table time. With all the facts in hand, it was time to make my collar. I turned to Wilson and pointed an accusing finger as I yelled, "Officer, for the murder of Dr. Brandon, I ask you to arrest Dr. Jeanette." On hearing this, Jeanette screamed like a cornered beast and tried to push past us to beat a retreat, but the uniform blocked his way and dropped the guy like a sack of potatoes. I could still feel Bob gawping at me as we made the drive back, so I decided to put him out of his misery and give him the rundown. When I figured strangulation wasn't cause of death, I was stumped. I'll admit, I kicked myself when it finally hit me. After all, the nitrous had been under my nose the whole time, literally. The penny only dropped when we heard about Sarah Butler, the patient from this morning. The open window, death without noticeable struggle, the scratching on the wall, the smear of blood on the victim's face all pointed at it. That ashtray sitting pretty with its contents all intact just sealed the deal. Once I had the murder weapon pegged, the next step was easy. Find someone who knew their way around nitrous oxide and just how lethal it could be. Jane was my first thought, her name on the wall, her jealousy over Brandon and Miss Jordan, it all lined up. But then I asked Jeanette about the morning's procedure. Did he squirm? He damn near wriggled out of his skin when we got too close to that nitrous machine. Finally, it hit me the J-A-N-E, or the first four letters of Jeanette. And then, well, that was a wrap. Jeanette's patients were all flocking to Brandon. The way he saw it, that was like taking money out of his pocket or food off his table. His office was a dump, and he had no assistant. Guy was barely scraping by. Put that with the fat checks he was sliding Brandon's way for poker losses, and you can see why he might want the doc out the picture. Jeanette's desk was covered in bank notices, by the way. He might as well have been giving Brandon rubber balls instead of checks. They were bouncing that much. Jeanette isn't just in trouble. He's circling the drain. Then there was the weekend trip. Brandon and Norma Jordan, Pearson's assistant, off in the country together. They just got back this morning, and I guess, for Jeanette, seeing the guy who had just about ruined him also get the girl was too much to bear. So, put simply, Jeanette had hated Brandon for years, in secret. He'd watched him take his patients, take his money, then take the girl. And he stewed over it till he was about ready to boil over. The weekend trip was the final straw. He knew Brandon's routine, always dead to the world, if you'll forgive the turn of phrase, right after lunch, right next to that nitrous tank. All these breadcrumbs left a big fat trail of means, motive, and opportunity straight to Dr. Jeanette. Bob mulled this all over as we drove to the nearest bar. "Damn near a tragic coincidence for the Butler kid then," he said eventually. "If he'd squeezed a second longer, we'd have pinned this whole thing on the wrong guy. He sure owes you, Mulligan." I laughed. "Maybe he can buy me a bourbon someday, when he's old enough to walk into a bar without getting carded." Like I said, sleuths, the house always wins, and the deck's always stacked against you. Even when it seems like you're on a hot streak, it's only a matter of time until a debt gets called, and you gotta cash in your chips. At least this time around, we kept a young kid from learning that the hard way. It's time to lay down our cards and leave with our winnings for now. The game, of course, is far from over. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your ears to the ground, and I'll see you when the next case calls.